In 2016, many people thought that it was a foregone conclusion that Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic nominee. However, four men stepped up and ran against her. You probably remember Bernie Sanders, and you might even remember Martin O'Malley, but you probably don't remember Lincoln Chaffee, the governor and senator from Rhode Island. Because, for whatever reason, rather than feeling the chafe, people felt the burn, and Bernie Sanders ended up being the main opposition candidate. Maybe it was because he had a message, maybe it was because he was distinctive in some way, but at any rate, Lincoln Chaffee did not catch on, and no one really felt the chafe. If Mitch Landrieu, the current mayor of New Orleans, were to run in 2020, as he apparently is thinking of doing, he would become the new Lincoln Chaffee. And in this video, I will explain precisely why. To properly understand Mitch Landrieu as a political actor, you have to understand first and foremost that he is the scion of a well-established political dynasty in Louisiana. The Landrieu family has been prominent, if not dominant, in Louisiana politics since at least the 1960s. Mitch's father, Moon Landrieu, and so far as I'm aware, Moon is his legal name, not his nickname, was the mayor of New Orleans from 1970 to 1978, and then he worked in the Carter administration as a secretary for housing and urban development. Moon is still alive, and I think that he's still semi-active and does speaking engagements. Mitch's older sister, Mary, was a Democratic senator from Louisiana from 1997 to 2015. And the most significant thing about Mary is that in 2007, there was a conservative organization which ranked all of the senators based on how conservative they are, and they found that she is the most conservative Democrat and that she ranked to the right of two Republicans. So if you're thinking about Mitch's political legacy, normally being a member of a political dynasty, say a Clinton or a Kennedy, is an advantage because it gives you name recognition. However, in the case of being a member of the Landrieu Dynasty, it means that no one is aware of your family outside of your own state. So it doesn't give you the name recognition, but it does come with a lot of baggage, since you will be associated with an unpopular senator in Mary Landrieu, and you will be expected to carry on her policies of being a Republican light. The kind of person who would stand no chance in a Democratic primary, in other words. So now that we've taken a look at the Landrieu dynasty, let's look at Mitch Landrieu's personal political resume. He was a member of the Louisiana House of Representatives from 1988 until 2004. The seat that he originally won in 1988 had just been vacated by his sister Mary, and he held that seat for 2 terms. And then in 1992, I think there was a redistricting, and then he held a new seat from 1992 up until 2004. At some point during his tenure in the Louisiana House, he ran and lost a mayoral contest against the son of another former mayor. I think that really goes a long way towards demonstrating the kind of nepotism that exists in Louisiana, and it should come as no surprise to you that Louisiana is consistently ranked as one of the most corrupt states in the country, because dynastic politics tend to encourage that kind of thing. It's worth noting, too, that in Louisiana, governors and lieutenant governors do not run on the same ticket, and they even have separate election days. So you often have a governor of one party and a lieutenant governor of another. In 2004, both Blanco, a Democrat, and Landrieu were elected together. So he was the lieutenant governor to Kathleen Blanco from 2004 until 2008, and then he was lieutenant governor under Bobby Jindal up until 2010. So he served under 2 different governors. Obviously, the major event of Blanco's administration was Hurricane Katrina. So, in theory, Mitch Landrieu should have gained quite a bit of experience with handling flooding and federal disaster relief and all that kind of stuff. But as we'll see, apparently it hasn't paid off much in his current job, or the job he's about to vacate in a couple months. In 2010, he was elected mayor of New Orleans and then reelected in 2014. His term will expire in May, if I'm not mistaken. Right now, Mitch Landrieu is 57 years old, and he will be 60 in November of 2020, so still quite a bit younger than a lot of the major contenders in the Democratic field, but 60 isn't young, so he can't really claim to represent a new generation or to be the voice of youth. One other note about being lieutenant governor, so far as I'm aware, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that lieutenant governors have any meaningful power or ability to actually govern unless the governor drops dead. So lieutenant governor is more or less an honorary position, and he most likely did not acquire any meaningful experience at that post. Another note that I'd like to make is about New Orleans itself. Now, New Orleans, despite being a well-known city, isn't large by the standard of a lot of other cities, and its media market doesn't really have a lot of reach. So getting even good press in New Orleans wouldn't necessarily make you a national star. However, New Orleans is big enough and prominent enough that if, say, it has major problems, that will get reported on in the national media. So basically, it's a high-risk, low-reward post to be the mayor of New Orleans if you're looking to use that post as a springboard into national office. If you're looking to, say, become governor of Louisiana, it's actually a great post. But if you're looking to, say, run for president, not exactly. As I mentioned before, Mitch Landrieu had previous experience as the lieutenant governor to both Blanco and then Jindal, meaning that he looked on as the two governors handled Katrina and its aftermath. So you would think that he would have learned something about, say, flood control or water management, but you would be wrong. So obviously, because New Orleans lies under the sea level, one of the most important jobs, if not the most important job of a New Orleans mayor, is to ensure that the city's drainage system, levees, and pumps are functioning at a high level. Well, a couple things. In 2017, there was a scare because at least 2 neighborhood pumps were operating at below 50% capacity, and 2 neighborhoods were in danger of being flooded out. So, that shows you how Landrieu is as a mayor. He had been in office since 2010, so there's no way to blame that on anyone but him. And also, since 2010, when he took office, and I think the last one was sometime in 2016, there were over a dozen warnings about the quality of the drinking water in the city. So a couple things could affect the drinking water potentially. One could just be seawater run-in, and the other one could be fracking fluid, since Louisiana is somewhere where they drill for oil and do other things. So, at any rate, you would think that someone like Mitch Landrieu, who had previous experience at a state level, would be able to manage something like this, and you would be mistaken. He is clearly incompetent at the most fundamental part of his job as the mayor of New Orleans. Speaking of Landrieu's conduct as the mayor of New Orleans, let's talk about how he has failed to deal with 2 of the city's most pressing issues, homelessness and crime. In terms of homelessness, for obvious reasons, the city of New Orleans has a smaller problem with it than it did before Katrina. If you look at the demographics, the city has shrunk considerably in terms of its total population. Therefore, there are fewer homeless people. However, that problem started to rise again within the last year or so because the city is experiencing rapidly rising rents and gentrification. The solution of Mitch Landrieu is to encourage people who have been priced out of their homes to go live in cheaper towns, which isn't really much of a solution. It's really just an abdication of his responsibility as mayor to help his constituents to remain in their native city if they so desire. As far as crime, the main problem is violent crime. Apparently, property crime is relatively under control, but violent crime is up. On June 3rd, 2017, 13 people in New Orleans were shot in a single day. And this is in a city of only 344,000. So that's a pretty high rate of shooting. That would be equal to 90 people being shot in one day in Chicago. And Chicago right now is notorious as being the shooting and violence capital of the United States. So if that were to happen in Chicago, 90 people were to get shot, that would make national news. But this largely went unreported outside of New Orleans, and I had to actually dig to find this stat. If you look at the violent crime rate per 100,000 residents, New Orleans is actually more dangerous than Chicago or Baltimore. And yes, the crime rate per capita is a lot more important than the total crime rate if you're thinking about your own personal safety. So, Chicago and Baltimore are actually safer places to live than New Orleans, which is astounding. And one of the major problems with Landrieu is that he has really consistently neglected the driving cause and underlying issue that is causing homelessness and crime: poverty. As Marcus Aurelius once said, poverty is the root of all crime. Generally speaking, when people have more money, they commit fewer crimes because they are less desperate. There are some idiots who will point out that many violent crimes are caused by mental health issues, but they forget that those are always the exception and not the rule. Most shootings are over money or drugs or something of that nature, like gang territory, which again mostly revolves around drugs. And drugs, of course, are important because they're worth a lot of money. And people wouldn't be in a gang in the first place if they had money to begin with. So it's not very hard to figure out. But Mitch Landrieu is more or less a neoliberal, and he is all about addressing problems as long as he doesn't actually have to act or come up with any kind of solution that has an economic component. So at this point, I'm guessing that a lot of you are probably thinking, well, why do you think Mitch is so far to the right? Because the only thing I know about him is that whole thing about the Confederate Monuments. So why are you saying he's to the right? How do you possibly know that? Pretty simple, and it has nothing to do with the fact that his sister is to the right. He is the leader, or one of the major leaders, along with Colorado Governor Hickenlooper, of what is called New Democracy. And New Democracy is a movement that is supposed to make the Democrats more competitive between the coast, because the accusation is that the Democrats under Obama and Hillary Clinton are too bi-coastal and they neglect the center of the country, which, by the way, is factually correct. However, their solution is really stupid, especially when it's in the context of what it's supposed to replace. So they call for moderation in order to appeal to the middle of the country, because apparently Hillary Clinton ran a campaign that lost because she was so far to the left. Remember all those lefty things she wanted to do, like perpetuate 7 wars and only raise the minimum wage to $12 and not institute single-payer health care, despite the fact most Americans want it? Yeah, so if we were just more conservative than that, and we ignore what the polls say in order to triangulate a position that calculates elite position, that will appeal to voters and make them turn out. Yeah. And the other really dumb thing about New Democracy is that this is a verbatim replay of Bill Clinton's Third Way and the DLC, Democratic Leadership Committee, which proposed the same bullshit back in the 80s and 90s. So the thing is, if you look at the Democratic Party, the people who are in charge of it are all Clintonistas. They're all people who were acolytes of Bill and Hillary. So basically, Mitch Landrieu, Hickenlooper, and the rest are proposing replacing the Clintonistas with a group of people who believe the exact same things but are different people. So, in other words, they don't really have a movement. So, another problem is that New Democracy is operating in a far different political environment than the early 90s. In the early 90s, it looked like Reagan had won a major victory and had caused a sea change in American politics. We're way beyond Reagan at this point, and it should be pretty clear that 2016 was a watershed election. The political landscape has changed drastically. The old politics of triangulating an imagined center and doing the sort of curled finger jab thing that Bill Clinton pioneered, those days are over. No one wants that anymore. That political strategy has failed. It's over. And another problem is that I can't really speak about Hickenlooper too much, even though I pictured him here, but Mitch Landrieu does not have Bill Clinton's charisma. One of the things that carried Bill Clinton to victory is that the man has undeniable charisma. That and Ross Perot won 19% of the vote. Let's not forget that. that was a pretty big factor in how Bill Clinton came to power. Mitch Landrieu does have a very small national presence, and that national presence comes from his actions during the controversial removal of Confederate monuments in New Orleans. Now, some things need to be noted about that. In one form or another, Mitch Landrieu has been running for the mayor seat of New Orleans since 1994. So from 1994 all the way up until 2014 when he ran for re-election and a second term, he had no known stance on the issue of Confederate monuments in the city. In fact, in 1999, as a member of the Louisiana State House, he even voted for having a Confederate flag bumper sticker as an option, or not bumper sticker, but license plate. So he clearly wasn't bothered by any of this stuff. And then there was the Dylann Roof shooting in 2015 in South Carolina, and that caused a widespread reaction where Black Lives Matter and other groups began to demand that Confederate monuments and flags be removed. And then all of a sudden, Mitch Landrieu proved that he had political opportunism in his veins. And he stepped in front of this movement and proclaimed himself to be its leader, even though he had nothing to do with organizing it, and he was definitely a Johnny-come-lately in the worst sense. Also, a lot of the monuments that he came out against and had removed were ones that were out of the way and virtually unknown to people who had lived in the city their entire lives. So, a lot of these monuments were not offending anybody because it's impossible to be offended by something that you don't even know exists. At any rate, he managed to really anger and alienate a lot of historical preservationists, many of whom are not even conservative at all. And for obvious reasons that I don't need to go into, he infuriated conservatives, which as a Democrat you'll do anyway. But if you're going to antagonize conservatives, you might as well make a point of some kind or pass a policy and not just do some symbolic gesture. But he decided to opt for symbolism because neoliberalism. He won some bona fides with Black Lives Matter and some other black community organizations, but that's about it, really. In terms of material gains, or say advancing the interest of the African American community in his city, he did diddly dick. The thing is, remember when we talked about people being priced out because of the rising rents? Well, guess which demographic is disproportionately affected by rising rents? You guessed it, minorities, especially black people. So if he really wanted to help them and help them feel comfortable in the city, maybe he should make sure that they can continue to live there by providing affordable housing or instituting rent controls. But no, he'll just take down a few statues of Confederate generals that most people didn't notice anyway. That'll help. That'll make people feel more welcome when they're not living in the city anymore. One of the worst things that could happen to a candidate for national office is if they have a lot of local enemies who are willing and eager to expose their failures to the nation. And in the case of Mitch Landrieu, he has plenty of willing and able opponents right there at home. Democratic activists in the city of New Orleans are unimpressed by Landrieu. They expected to have an ally in him as the mayor, and they've been deeply disappointed at every turn. Even the people who were in favor of statue removal are a little bit pissed to some extent because he took credit for something that they did all the legwork for. And he didn't really express any interest in their cause or any support until he just sort of came out and took credit for it. Not that many people are aware of the names of the people who organized against these monuments and built up public support for their cause. But Mitch Landrieu got interviewed by Rachel Maddow. So, like anybody, people want recognition for their work, and there are quite a few pissed off activists, even though he helped them get what they wanted. Not to mention the activists who are, say, in favor of fighting poverty or want to have a functioning water system. They're also kind of pissed. Probably the most searing critique from the left was written by Michael Stein. He wrote an article in the New Republic, and I won't really go into the details of it, but basically he laid out the case that Mitch Landrieu is unsuitable as a potential presidential candidate, and that anyone who thinks that he should run should really look into his record and realize that he's incompetent and way too far to the right to have any chance in the Democratic primary. So if you're interested in learning more about Mitch Landrieu, I would think that that would be the first place to go. I found another article by a guy named Jeff Cruary. I assume that's how you say his name. He seems to be in the center, maybe center right. He's certainly not a right winger. And he wrote an article where he said in the title that it's a monumental mistake to pick Landrieu. In the article itself, he paints Landrieu as inexperienced in the private sector, which is why I think he's probably center-right. Most liberals don't really give a shit if you have experience in the private sector, since it has literally nothing to do with actual governing. And that he's unaccomplished in the public sector, and that he has shown an inability to get things done. So, while there are just some hit pieces from the right, I think that the thing I found this image from was just a straight-up hit piece. There are some fairly intelligent critiques of him from the right. And you know when the Republicans are able to make intelligent critiques that a Democrat must be truly horrible, since many Republican critiques of things are ridiculous and vacuous, to be polite. Speaking of things that are ridiculous and vacuous, Mitch Landrieu has won an award that is both of those things. He won the Woke Award from Essence in the summer of 2017. And this is in honor of him helping to remove the Confederate Monuments and speaking out about race here and there in various speeches that he gave. Now, I don't want to demean this too much. Any award is a good one, even if it's a Razzie for Worst New Actor. But, different awards have different values, and I seriously doubt that the Woke Award will really have a lot of cachet when Mitch Landrieu tries to run for president starting in late 2019. I just don't see this award being something that Democratic voters look at and say, holy fuck, we gotta vote for this guy. He won the Woke Award. He must be woke AF. So I just don't see this as being all that significant of an accomplishment. But because Mitch Landrieu is a fairly uninteresting and unaccomplished guy, I guess this is his highlight. Maybe this will end up being the absolute pinnacle of his career. If so, I hope he had a good time at the award ceremony. Having now established who Mitch Landrieu is and why he sucks, let's now look at the potential bases that he could draw on to try to make a bid for the nomination. So, the two groups that he's cultivated are black voters and SJWs. I call SJWs so-called SJWs because defining what an SJW is a bit complicated, since different people have different standards. But let's just use the term and assume that we're all talking about the same thing. Anyway, the problem with black voters is that they tend to prefer black candidates or known quantities. And the thing is, outside of Louisiana, Mitch Landrieu is still not all that well known as an ally of the black community. So, black voters by this point are a lot more familiar with Bernie Sanders. He's been in the limelight for a few years, and there are a lot of black activists who are very big Bernie supporters and have gone out and told all of their friends about it. Also, Kamala Harris is black. So, it's really unclear why those voters would switch their affiliation on a whim to a mayor from New Orleans who isn't doing that great of a job. There's also a potential backlash in the Deep South because of Doug Jones. So even if Landrieu might be able to draw on some blacks in the Deep South, it is possible that the community as a whole will feel betrayed because of the fuckery of one Senator Doug Jones. Remember, he was just elected in a special election against a child molester, and he has gone to the Senate and voted with President Trump 100% of the time. He won on the strength of the black female vote. And for him to vote 100% of the time with President Trump is nothing less than a full-blown betrayal of the people who put him in office. The voters in Alabama who elected him did not want him to go and be a Trump puppet. And it's possible that this backlash could extend over to Louisiana and other Deep South states and make the black community very weary of so-called Southern Democrats. So this could be a factor, if this backlash materializes in the way that I think it could, that would really hurt Mitch Landrieu's chances, slim as they already are. The other thing is his other base is SJWs. And SJWs, despite the fact that they tend to make a lot of noise and that videos about them tend to get a lot of attention, they're politically irrelevant, at least in the United States. Now, maybe in Canada or Britain they are a bit more relevant, but here they really don't control anything. The extent of their power is that once in a while they can get someone to not speak at a campus, and that's about all they can accomplish. They don't really control anything in terms of institutionalized power, at least not at this point, and the sense that I have is that their power is in decline. At any rate, the SJWs have embraced Mitch Landrieu, and they think of him as being woke and someone who is on the right side of the issue of race. The thing is, though, SJWs are inherently unreasonable. So, if they see Mitch Landrieu running and there is another candidate who is either female or a minority, they will suddenly change their stance on whether or not he is woke if he is running against them. These are the same kind of people who would say that running against Hillary Clinton is inherently sexist. They might very well extend that to someone like Kamala Harris or Kirsten Gillibrand. So, again, like, he could go from being a hero of this community to being just another racist, white privilege, misogynistic white man if he happens to run against someone who's either female or a minority. And if we look at a lot of the contenders for 2020, many of them are female. So there's a pretty good chance that if Landrieu started to make a run for it, he would encounter this difficulty. So the two most important factors in any given primary are what is the political climate and who's running. So let's take a look and see what the political climate of 2020 is likely to be like, and then consider who Mitch Landrieu will have to run against. Right now, most Democratic voters want progressive policies, and I can't really see that changing within the next couple years. If anything, this will remain constant, most likely. If it does diminish, it will not diminish much, and it might even increase. So that's something that will not help Mitch Landrieu. If I had to guess right now, in March of 2018, what the major issues are going to be in the Democratic primary in 2020, I would guess that those issues would be in this order. A, progressive policies, i.e. who will push for what. B, the Red Scare nonsense. The Democrats are not going to let go of that anytime soon, as evidenced by all of the CIA operatives they're running for office. And C, electability. Who can beat the dreaded Orange Menace? So the problem with Mitch Landrieu is that on two of these three things, he will fall flat pretty horribly. He's not progressive. He can't really run on that. He can run on being racially progressive, but the fact is most people don't really care that much about that. In a party where everybody is racially progressive for the most part. That's not really an accomplishment. It's kind of like being a Republican who likes guns and Jesus. It's really just a given. The other thing is, whenever you have a Red Scare or any kind of saber-rattling against foreign countries, one thing that would help you in a primary would be foreign policy experience. So if you're going to make a run from relative obscurity to being a major figure, you need some kind of foreign policy experience, even if that's just serving on a committee in the Senate or the House. And Mitch Landrieu has never held an elected office outside of Louisiana. So he has no foreign policy experience. And he also hasn't even been governor of a state. So he's never commanded even the National Guard. So he would not really fare very well in this field. He couldn't really talk about policies that anybody would care about, and he also couldn't sell himself as being the kind of tough, experienced leader who can guide us through difficult times. The establishment will probably try to paint him as electable, since the establishment is always looking for a reason to run to the right or to hold back progressives. But the thing is, any article claiming that he's electable will be a joke, since to be electable in a general election, you have to actually be able to get through a primary. And there's no way in hell that Mitch Landrieu will get through a Democratic primary, because he really doesn't have a voter base, and even the establishment, with all of its money and corporate support, can't give him a base of actual voters to put him over. And even beyond that, I just don't think that he would be their first, second, or third choice when it comes to who to back against Bernie Sanders. So I really see zero path for Mitch Landrieu. In an earlier video, I scoffed at Tim Kaine's chances of winning the Democratic nomination and becoming president. However, I never denied that he had a chance. In the case of Mitch Landrieu, I feel completely confident saying that this man has no chance of getting anywhere near the Democratic nomination, much less the presidency. So let's talk about some realistic expectations for Landrieu's future. He's too high profile to retire at this point, and he's still young enough to run for various offices. He also has proven that he has an ability to be a solid political opportunist, as evidenced by the fact that he was able to take credit for Confederate monument removal despite being a Johnny-come-lately in the worst possible way. There's a very small chance that he could be a dark horse VP pick to balance out a progressive or a northerner on the ticket. I think that the geographical spread on tickets, that is now an outdated idea to always put a southerner somewhere on the ticket. Obviously, Obama and Biden had 0 southerners, and yet they did way better in the South than most recent tickets had. However, it is possible that someone with very traditional and limited thinking will be the nominee, and that then that person will see something in Mitch Landrieu that no one else other than Mitch Landrieu sees. He could always run for the Senate or the House of Representatives. Both of those things would give him a greater national profile and would also build his resume in terms of foreign policy, which is the biggest gap and deficiency on that resume other than his tenure as mayor of New Orleans, which he can now do nothing about. He could also go and do something that no Landrieu has ever done and be governor of Louisiana. So that would be a major achievement. And he could do that, maybe. I don't really know the exact conditions of state politics at this point, or just how much hatred he's incurred as the mayor, but I assume he'd probably be a better governor than, say, Bobby Jindal. And that's not saying much, but, maybe he'll try that. Maybe he could also follow in his father's footsteps once again and hold a cabinet position. I don't really know what position you would give someone like Mitch Landrieu since he has no discernible skills, but maybe he could be the ambassador to, Estonia or something. Sure. Another option is he could just use his fame and try to parlay that into being a corporate news host or analyst. Rick Santorum and a bunch of other people who were semi-popular have managed to do that, and they've probably made quite a bit of money doing it. So if Mitch Landrieu wants to make some money, then that might be the way to go. So anyway, those are what I think are his realistic expectations. I think we can already go ahead and rule out the possibility of him getting anywhere near the nomination in 2020.